Welcome to today's event, Hard Beats and Soft Power, Music and International Diplomacy, part of Perry Worldhouse's Global Lens programming on global art, film, music, writing, and more. I'm delighted to introduce our panel of distinguished diplomats and talented musicians today and to moderate today's event. Lolita Jackson is Executive Director of Communications and Sustainable Cities at Sustainable Development Capital, LLC, and a visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse. She was previously the Special Advisor for Climate Policy and Programs in the New York City Mayor's Office, serving as the climate diplomat for New York City. She's a 1989 alum of the Penn School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, majoring in applied science, was co-president of the Penn Class of '89, and a 2007 winner of the Penn Alumni Award of Merit. Ambassador András Simonyi is a former Hungarian ambassador now living and working in Washington, D.C. He was managing director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins SAIS, presently working with George Washington School of Engineering and Applied Science. He was Hungary's ambassador to the United States from 2002 to 2007, and the first Hungarian ambassador to NATO. Last but not least, Ambassador Sandy Verschbow is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center on Strategy and Security in Washington, D.C., and the Wolk Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Perry Worldhouse. He was Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2012 to 2016, the first American to hold that position. A career diplomat since 1977, Verschbow served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea, as U.S. Ambassador to Russia, and as U.S. Ambassador to NATO. I'd like to invite all the panelists now to turn on their cameras. And thank you for taking your time to be with us here today to talk about music and diplomacy. And I want to turn the floor over to all of you for short opening remarks, starting with Lolita.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here, Perry Worldhouse. Thanks, Professor Horowitz. So my name is Lolita Jackson, and I went to China 5 times to sing jazz and funk music. We were invited by an art gallery, and they wanted to introduce Western culture, and particularly the Black American traditions of music. I'm an American descendant of slaves, and many in China had never met a Black American before. There are many Black African students and Black Africans in China, but very few Black Americans. And so I had to learn how to say "washamegwarin," which means I'm American, very quickly once I got there. I also, however, because of my day job, I was able to lecture at Jiao Tong Business School in Shanghai, as well as meeting the officials in charge of the planning process for the 5-year plan for China, particularly in Shanghai, at Shanghai City Hall during my stays there. So in essence, I was doing both things at the same time. Got to play in all the great jazz clubs and also got some business done. I want to reference something called Wind of Change, which many of you may have heard of. It was a podcast that aired last year about the band Scorpion and the song Wind of Change potentially being written by the CIA. And one of the segments, he talked about Black Americans being sent overseas to perform as a cultural diplomacy. And one of the things that he mentioned was there were goodwill tours to counter Soviet propaganda about US hypocrisy on race at the time in the 60s, particularly African countries after they obtained their independence. So Nina Simone was sent to Lagos in 1961 by a group called the American Society of African Culture, which was revealed later to be a front for the CIA. She never was aware of this, but that's just an example of how cultural diplomacy was used to counter some of the main things that were happening in the world at the time, particularly with the US race situation. So I was not sent by the CIA, but I wanted to show that there is a history of this cultural diplomacy, particularly when it comes to Black American musicians and artists. Because most Chinese and Japanese, I've actually sung at art festivals in Japan as well, only hear of Blacks in sports and entertainment. That sadly was actually my main portal to acceptance in other areas where I actually needed to get business done and work done. People appeared much more interested in my singing because that's comfortable and expected. Lolita Jackson being the climate diplomat for New York City was not expected. So I've actually had significant problems with certain entities, particularly in the Middle Eastern countries, I have to say, when I've had to meet with them, because I'm not supposed to be in charge. So they were looking for someone else to be that person. And I wonder, I'd love for us to discuss later if that's a problem in the Foreign Service where, Americans come in all shapes and sizes and colors, but are some of those folks a little less accepted in countries where they're not typically expected. But going back to the positive note, because I actually am told I'm a very good singer and I actually use some local musicians, there was much more acceptance of me being able to be there and really show, my great grandfather, my great grandmother, excuse me, was a slave. I have, because I'm the youngest of the youngest of the youngest, I'm only 4 generations from slavery. So I was able to talk about the traditions of some of the songs, to the point that there was someone from Inner Mongolia at one of my concerts, and he starts crying after he sees me sing. And I was like, wow, the music move you that much? He said, I've never seen anybody move when they perform. He had gone to a conservatory in China where he was taught to never move when he sang. So to see someone be expressive, and I sang a song that I knew my grandfather had played on the slide guitar at the juke joints back in Northern Florida. So there was a connection directly to that historical tradition. It really moved him. So if I was able to go and show people what's possible and what they could actually import into their own culture, I felt that I had done a good thing. I've had many times where I've gone to Scotland, actually, and I'll close with this. So I have a band in Scotland. And every time I go to Scotland, I perform with this band. But also during the daytime, I would go visit all the climate people. So I know the Secretary of Climate for Scotland. I know all the people who are in Glasgow, who are running COP26 right now. So I always say a stop clock is right twice a day. So I'm making the joke that it's 10 minutes to 2. It's my time, because I knew everybody in Scotland when they announced that COP26 was going there. So because I'd been singing there, people had gone to my shows and gone to the Fringe, they knew me, they were comfortable with me, and I'm the one that introduced them to all the major climate networks, all the major people from the US who want to go. I knew everybody because of my singing. So the singing really was helpful to give me a portal to be able to do so much more in my day job. And I look forward to questions and talking more about some of the maybe more provocative things that I said in my comments. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ambassador Shimoni.
Thank you so much. And what a pleasure. And first of all, what I want to do, I want to shock Lolita, because the first American I ever met in 1959 was Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, we were sitting on an airplane, and I was flying alone, and Paul Robeson sat me on his knee and sang Old Man River to me, just to me. So that's where I want to start. And with this, I want to explain that for many, many years, I was on the receiving end of American music diplomacy. I grew up with rock and roll. Just want to make very clear to everyone that growing up behind the Iron Curtain, most of the students don't even know what the Iron Curtain was, but that was the physical and mental barrier between East and West, the communist East and the democratic West. And growing up in behind the Iron Curtain, music, rock and roll music coming in through the airwaves meant everything to us. If you want music, rock and roll music was our internet, our connection to the free world. It was our social media. And you would think it was just one way, a one-way communication, but it wasn't. Actually, music, rock and roll music, if you want musical people's diplomacy, was really what broke the monopoly of Marxism and Leninism in Eastern Europe. And I'd like to think you to think about this for a moment. Fast forward in 1971, I met Dizzy Gillespie, spent an evening with Dizzy Gillespie when he came to Budapest with the jazz ambassadors. They were your predecessors, Lolita. They were. It was an incredible group of people. It was Mingus. It was Dizzy Gillespie. It was Charles Mingus. It was Art Blakely, and it was Thelonious Monk. So it was kind of the superstars of jazz, and they were sent to Eastern Europe to send a message of freedom from the United States. They did a pretty good job. Fast forward, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And in just a year's time, I found myself in Brussels, the first Hungarian diplomat to work on NATO. And my ambition was to get Hungary into NATO because that's what I felt, that my country would be safe and the future of democracy would be safe. We can debate about that later. If we get into NATO, and I met a person, a wonderful young American diplomat with whom, before we even started talking business, before we even started talking diplomacy, we talked about rock and roll music. And it turns out that we had the same taste in rock and roll music. And that sealed our friendship forever. That diplomat was Sandy Verschbow. That was in 1992. I also want to say that, it only shows that, not everyone who love rock and roll music think alike. But I can promise you, those who think alike about democracy and freedom, they all love rock and roll music. And I say this because when a few years later I came to the United States, I arrived at the airport and shockingly at the airport, I walked off the plane with a diplomatic bag in one hand and a Fender Telecaster in my other hand. And I just thought this was going to be, just I'll jam a little here and there. But then Sandy and I came up with the idea to put together a band called the Coalition of the Willing. And before you think it was just a joke, I have to tell you that gave me a bandwidth, explaining to Americans that not only do I speak some broken English, but I also speak rock and roll language, which is the indigenous language of Americans. It gave me a bandwidth which no other diplomat in Washington had. And I'm forever grateful to Sandy for helping to come up with the name and to start that band. But I just want to stop here by saying that often I wonder how this game-changing cultural phenomenon called rock and roll relates to today's world. Because people keep asking me, well, what is rock and roll today? And I keep telling people, please think about rock and roll as a metaphor for something that speaks to both the hearts and the minds. And there are so many lessons to be drawn from what we have learned, how we used rock and roll in communicating with each other, how it actually helped change the world for the better. And I just encourage you to explore deeply go really deep into what this could be for today and what this could mean for today's young generations and the next generation of diplomats. I'll stop here. Thank you. And I'd like to introduce my friend, Ambassador Vershbow.
Well, thanks very much, András. It's great to recall our first meetings when we realized that even though I was a middle-class white guy from the Boston suburbs and you were living behind the Iron Curtain, we did listen to the same music growing up, and it created a bond that changed our careers, and you really made the most of it. My only regret is that I was abroad most of the time. The Coalition of the Willing was in its prime and performing in spectacular venues, even performing for former President Bush in Kennebunkport. But the coverage I got in the Russian press and later in the Korean press gave me some street credibility. So, during my career, I found that music was not only a powerful tool for breaking down political and cultural barriers between nations, but it did, as András said, play an outsized role in bringing down the Iron Curtain. So it certainly helped me in carrying out my diplomatic mission, especially during my time as ambassador to Russia, which was the early Putin days, 01 to 05, and as ambassador to Korea, when I really became not only as a tough-talking diplomat, but as the drumming ambassador. And the Korean media once flattered me by saying, he beats the drum almost as well as he beats up Kim Jong-il. But in both of my postings as ambassador, I was able to put my not too impressive drumming skills to good use and to convey a softer image of the United States and what people thought was the role of the US ambassador. Now, I actually had my music debut in the former Soviet Union long before joining the Foreign Service in 1977. I had the opportunity as a 17-year-old language student to visit the USSR in the summer of 1969, which was quite an eye-opening experience and did shape my choice of diplomacy as a career. But I'll never forget, I wasn't able to bring my drums, but I also was able to strum chords on the guitar. And I remember playing the guitar on the boardwalk in Yalta and singing songs from the Beatles' White Album, which had just come out, with Ukrainian and Russian kids. And although this was forbidden music, and of course they could only listen to it on the BBC and on the VOA through lots of jamming, they had already memorized a lot of the words, including what became my signature tune with the Coalition of the Willing, which is Back in the USSR, the only song I've dared to sing before a live audience. But of course, this experience is especially poignant today with Yalta, the jewel of Crimea, now under Russian occupation. But that experience showed me how music was great for breaking the ice, overcoming the fear of foreigners among these Russian kids, and enabling us to have relaxed conversations about life in the USSR, what America and the West were really like. And it all was thanks to their fascination with Obladi, Oblada, and other great tunes from that Beatles album. Now, fast forward to my time as ambassador, I would say that it may be not well known, but one of the unwritten parts of an ambassador's job description, at least in the US system, is particularly those who have large official residences at their disposal, is to be kind of an impresario. And in both Moscow and Seoul, which has a less palatial residence than Spaso House in Moscow, but still it's a beautiful example of Korean architecture. My wife and I hosted at least one concert every month, inviting hundreds and hundreds of guests from all walks of life to hear visiting American jazz and classical performers, as well as talented local musicians who were thrilled to have top billing at the U.S. ambassador's residence and even willing to perform for free. We had all kinds of music: classical, jazz, klezmer, tango, opera singers, religious choirs. We imported an ensemble from Boston that did a whole cabaret evening for the Russians, and it turned out that they knew all those words as well. But the appeal of great music in a spectacular, glamorous setting, not to mention the unlimited food and drink after the concert, brought people together that the embassy would never otherwise have been able to reach. Officials, politicians, scholars, artists of all kinds, even intelligence officials. And it created a way of getting people to know each other, both for our embassy, but even the Russians themselves would say, we would never have met some of these people if it wasn't for the convening power that you had organizing these concerts in Spaso House. And the added bonus for me was the chance to sit in from time to time on the drums. And in Korea, there was even a blues band where we did whole blues evenings in the residence. And I'll have lots of unforgettable memories going down through the years of playing with Igor Butman's big band in Spaso House, or even playing Gene Krupa's famous drum solo in Airmail Special with the Soul Pops Orchestra. I don't think I'll have those opportunities again. But my only regret is that the Coalition of the Willing, despite its renown in the US, was never able to cross the ocean and perform in Moscow or Seoul. And I had fewer opportunities to play the drums when I was as Deputy Secretary General of NATO. We had too much going on, including the invasion of Ukraine. But the Czech ambassador to NATO, who András may know, Jiří Šedivý, who is also a very good guitarist, he put together a band for our farewell party in 2016. And this was 2 years after the invasion of Ukraine. And when I sang back in the USSR with the Russian ambassador to NATO in the audience, he walked up and handed me a bottle of post-2014 Crimean champagne, which I, of course, that evening had to pour down the toilet. So it was an interesting experience being able to kind of live my fantasy life as a drummer. And as I said, it helped me learn just how powerful music can be in overcoming differences between nations and creating a kind of universal language that brings people together. But thanks. I look forward to the discussion. Back to you, Mike.
Thanks so much. I mean, this was a tremendous start, and I kind of wanted you to think, maybe we could think a little conceptually about this. Curious what you think about this. You know, what are some of the skills a musician has? You know, you're all diplomats in a way, and very skilled musicians. What are some of the skills that a musician has that are useful for diplomacy? Or you know, what are some skills that a diplomat has that might be useful in music?
I'll start. I'll say particularly if you're a jazz musician, you often have to improvise. If you are a singer and have to scat, it's all about coming up with the right notes that fit into the chord structure. And I would say that directly ties to diplomacy. So when I was basically, quote unquote, dissed by someone in a diplomatic situation, I had to figure out quickly how to turn it around and make it work anyway. And so I found that my ability to come up with the right notes at the right time directly correlated to my ability to handle thorny situations.
Yes, it's interesting because I think one of the things that definitely makes sense is intuition. Intuition helps a lot. I think 95% of what a diplomat does are things that he learned, he studied, but that 5%, the 5% that really makes a difference, that's intuition. And if you're a musician, you're much better able to use your intuitive skills. But I'd also like to say that, interestingly enough, improvisation, I totally agree. Sometimes we diplomats, we go into a meeting, we have no idea what we're talking about, but we're very good at improvising. But I think on a more serious note, it gives you a lot of discipline. You have to listen to the other. You have to figure out how to fit in. You want to stand your ground as a musician, especially if sometimes you're allowed to do some solos. You need to make sure that, you know, it makes sense. You know, improvisation is the most complicated and the most difficult thing in the world, but it looks easy. Well, that's really what I think gives us, I think musicians have an edge. Diplomat musicians have an edge compared to others.
Sandy?
It's hard to top both those answers. I certainly agree on improvisation. I would throw in courage. Sometimes in diplomacy, you have to go and deliver a message that's either going to anger the host government, or maybe a position you don't agree with, and you have to, which was my experience in Moscow and having to defend the Iraq War back in 2003. So having courage to go before a hostile audience, and particularly if you're not particularly talented as a musician, and plow on through would be one thing. And the other is flexibility. I often found that I would show up at a reception or something, and people would say, "Surprise, we've borrowed a drum set for you to play with us tonight." And there was no band. They wanted me just to get up there and do solos. So you had to be flexible and gracious, but try to get through it as quickly as you can.
Let me add something. I remember one of the first conversations we had when we started as a band, and Sandy, definitely you must remember this. We had a jazz musician as one of our guests, and this jazz and Jeff Baxter, Skunk Baxter, who is you know, of Steely Dan and Doobie Brothers fame, and he's our lead guitarist. And we had a conversation, and suddenly this jazz musician says, "You know, the scariest thing about music is that it's worse than standing naked on stage, because you open your heart and you are more vulnerable as a musician. But that, on the other hand, makes you and I like what Sandy said. you're courageous. You have to be courageous as a musician, and I think that translates very well into, honestly, I think Sandy and I were pretty courageous diplomats.
So the next question I have actually comes from the Q&A, and wondering about the role of music in the context of the way a lot of authoritarian regimes have tried to censor music. Say like, Sandy mentioned Korea, Kim Jong-un's North Korean regime censors music and destroys contraband tapes and CDs. Why are authoritarian regimes scared of popular music?
You want me to take that?
Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll tell you. Yes, Sandy. Why don't you go ahead? Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think the Soviets set the trend here. Initially, it was interesting that they embraced American jazz in the 1920s for ideological reasons. They thought it was the music of the oppressed African American masses, and therefore they were all for it. But after Stalin took over, they changed their minds, decided it was emblematic of the chaos and decadence of bourgeois society. And so jazz was suppressed, had to go underground. But I think they were right that jazz and in its way after jazz faded in favor of rock, that it is the music of freedom. And it's the kind of the spontaneity that's involved in jazz improvisation and in a wild rock and roll solo is a threat to the official ideology in an authoritarian regime. It's a little different in the case of North Korea, of course, because there's another Korea down the road, which is one of the most dynamic democracies, free market systems, and they need to suppress the knowledge of their own people and just how much better South Korea is than North Korea. I think the South Koreans sometimes don't appreciate their own soft power, with President Moon today actually discouraging human rights groups from sending balloons with thumb drives and CDs of Korean pop music and movies. Nothing more than that would ultimately open up the North Korean regime, which the South Koreans claim to want, rather than preventing this sort of cultural infiltration in a positive sense.
When the North Korean defects to South Korea, the first thing they want to do is go to a rock concert. But this is not new. In the early 1820s, somebody asked the emperor, who is more dangerous, Goethe, the writer, the poet, or Beethoven? And the answer was Beethoven. There's something about music that speaks to the heart and mind. Fast forward, I'll tell you why authoritarian regimes are scared of our music. Because our music is about the freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And there's nothing more dangerous than empower people and let them say whatever they want, and allow them to give expression to their feelings. That's why authoritarian regimes are so much afraid. It's kind of bizarre because in the early 60s, the communist countries of the East did not pay much attention to rock and roll music. And then suddenly they realized that the youth of Eastern Europe embraced rock and roll music, made it their own, and turned it basically against the regimes. And I can tell you that that indigenous Central European, including Russian rock and roll, was one of the most potent, most powerful tools to fight the regimes. So that's really why they're afraid of our kind of music, which is based on freedom of expression.
Lolita, you want to jump in on this one, or should I move on? So let me turn to you, Lolita, actually, then for the next question, and kind of wondering how you mentioned You mentioned Nina Simone and Winds of Change. To what extent do you think arts and culture are inherently political? It's one of the things that makes them powerful. So how, in some ways this builds off the last question, a slightly different direction, but how have you thought about that, both as a performer and thinking about what to perform, given your sort of public profile, and as a consumer of music?
All right. It's interesting because as a performer, you're right, the music is political. So I refuse to sing blues music. So when I go over to Europe and people are like, are you a blues singer? I can say no, because they expect me to sing blues. I was the lead singer of a Steely Dan. Yes, I was the lead singer of a Steely Dan cover band for 2 years. Drive west on Sunset to the sea. So I can do Donald Fagen too, but that was not expected. So I always tried to do the unexpected to have them understand that Americans come in all sizes, shapes, and guises, and that I don't have to just sing gospel and blues music. Also, I was a classical bass clarinetist, which people don't expect either. So for me, my decisions on what I performed were directly tied to what I wanted people to learn about Black Americans. And in Scotland, I found that they have a very unique history with funk music. So the band Average White Band, which had a very famous song in the 70s, called Pick Up the Pieces. Everybody thought if they were Black, they were all from Scotland. So if you do funk music in Scotland, they love it. So my band in Scotland is a 9-piece funk band, all white guys and me. But that was a cultural thing that they grabbed onto, thrived with, and loved. And they have very good funk musicians there. The best bass player I've ever played with in my life is a Scottish white guy, not a Black guy here. So looking at the appreciation of what certain people had for music, and going A, outside of the boundaries of what they thought I was supposed to do, but B, also embracing when they do really like that music on their own. For me, that was my way of dealing with it politically. And because of that love that they have for that music, I had inroads into Scottish politicians. So I know many, many MSPs. As I said, I know the Cabinet Secretary for Climate. They've come to my shows.
May I make one little comment? It's interesting what you say about blues music. Kind of I shock people. I go down and play at a place called Madam's Organ here in Washington, D.C., which is a great blues place. And people are shocked when I go on stage and I sing Hoochie Coochie Man, because I'm not supposed to sing Hoochie Coochie Man. And I make a point of letting them know that nobody owns nobody owns jazz, nobody owns blues, nobody owns rock and roll, and it's perfectly okay for Johnny Winter, the whitest white guy, to sing the blues, and it's perfectly okay for an African American not to want to sing the blues. I just wanted to add this because this is really, and if we do it right, if we do it in the right way, this in itself sends an incredible message about our societies, and and that's part of the message, the narrative we had with the Coalition of the Willing as a diplomatic band.
Yeah, I always thought the Coalition of the Willing was defying stereotypes by having a bunch of policy wonks who could rock and roll, and with maybe the exception of back in the USSR, having a pretty non-political choice of repertoire that we would sing. It also reminded me, András, remember your farewell from NATO when you were ambassador to NATO, and we sang to the tune of Hoochie Coochie Man, Hungarian NATO Man, instead of who didn't have a black cat bone, but he had a black cell phone.
Yeah, but I just want to. So the one thing we all decided, and this is important, we all decided when we put together the Coalition of the Willing, we either do it in a serious way. You don't want to be called the singing ambassadors. That's the last thing you want to do. You want to make sure they understand that this is damn serious. It's got a message. This is not some aging, white guys wanna show off their guitar skills, but there's a message there, and that is where that's where you have the borderline between something really serious and something which can turn into a farce is. But I think it's totally doable, and I hope, Lolita, you will confirm that if it's serious music, if they see that you put your heart into it and you're trying your best, I think it becomes very much part of your diplomatic narrative.
I agree with that, because if you show excellence in everything you do, and I have to say, I know I'm a good singer and my band is killing it, then they say, wow, she's a good singer and she's good at what she does during the day with me. So it all comes together. If I was just singing happy birthday and like drunkenly at the mic, I wouldn't be taken seriously, but I would not go on that stage unless I was good. I'll add another quick thing, Professor Horowitz, that for C40, which is a climate organization of cities around the world, they had this global mayor summit. At the end of that summit, the head of C40, myself, and 5 other people put together a band. Everybody came there, but it was at the end of the time. And it was just like, was the coda for the event versus coming out saying, hey, I'm a singer and I happen to work for New York City. That elevated and escalated everything even farther for them to see the head of the entire conference and me and others on the stage afterwards. So I totally agree with you, Ambassador.
So we've talked about this a lot in the context, a little bit of music, a bit maybe as a Western export or sort of a U.S. export, and sort of American-ish, maybe like music abroad. What are some examples that maybe you all could think about or know of other countries maybe sending cultural acts here to the U.S. in the spirit of advancing diplomacy? Since certainly this doesn't just go one way.
For me, I would say Japan, because I have a good relationship with Japan, and Japan loves culturally Black jazz music. In fact, when the tsunami happened, one of the first things in New York that happened as far as a fundraiser was Black jazz musicians in Harlem, because they said, we go there and we tour all the time and they love us. We want to show them our love. But going the other way has not been as much to our community. However, seeing koto musicians, seeing shamisen, seeing the beauty of the music is really, really moving and powerful. And so I've been fortunate enough to see that. And I know that that's something that's very effective when people see that here in the US for the first time who've never been to Japan.
Certainly, this is not an American monopoly. And when I was here in Washington as the Hungarian ambassador, of course, I invited all kinds of incredible musicians from Hungary to perform at the embassy, as did Sandy in Seoul and Moscow, because otherwise this whole thing would have become a joke that this guy only wants to show off his rock and roll skills. No, we used music, especially music, as a means to attract people. And we had way back already, and Sandy might remember, way back in Brussels when I was still an aspiring future member of NATO. I had an evening with gypsy musicians, Hungarian gypsy musicians. There's a very famous Hungarian gypsy musician in Brussels who used to play with Stefan Grappelli of Django Reinhardt fame. And it made a big difference. It softened a lot of things. What we were trying to explain is how we, in our work, used music. And I'm not a classical musician, I can't use it, but I had world-class performers from all genres helping me out at the embassy as an ambassador. So there is no monopoly to this, but I think honestly this rock and roll thing is a very, 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 jazz and rock and roll is a very, very special example that one might want to study in depth.
Just adding to my answer, I forgot to mention this. Every year, there's many Chinese dancers and Chinese musicians that come to New York in particular, because there are 700,000 people of Chinese descent in New York City, but also just to culturally have more people see and understand what their culture is like. But so I forgot that because that happens every year. It's like there are flyers everywhere, like they want everybody to come see this show.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think that what impressed me about South Korea was not only their rising to the top of the charts and with K-pop and with Korean TV drama series, but also they produce incredible classical musicians. And I think if you go to a concert these days at with the Philadelphia Orchestra or the New York Philharmonic, you're going to see a lot of Koreans playing in the first chairs of the orchestra. And same with Russia. And I think one of their best exports is sending a lot of their classical music ensembles who may, not always the top tier ones, but they get to travel across the US. I spent a lot of time with a chamber orchestra called Kremlin, which crisscrossed the Middle West for several years. And I think that served a useful role in kind of building bridges between the two countries.
We have a question from the audience wondering about music as a platform for mutual understanding. It asks, what have the speakers learned, heard, and or understood from the music of other countries? Somebody want to jump in?
Sandy?
Yeah, we're all stumped by that question.
It's a good question. Nice job, Lydia.
Yeah. Well, one thing I learned as a drummer is that there are drumming cultures that we don't fully appreciate. In Korea, they have whole bands of different folk drums. I think I tried to take some lessons once when I was traveling down south to Gyeongju, and you'd see in Seoul these parades of people mostly playing percussion. It opened my eyes to kind of some of the differences, even as the Koreans were imitating American rock trends. They had their own cultural tradition that they continue to revere and preserve. And there was no opportunity too low for me to seize to play the drums with my host population.
Let me, yeah, this gave me a little time to think about my response. Think about it this way: there isn't a more democratic genre than rock and roll. If you go around the world, you will see that the rock and roll of Russia is different from the rock and roll in Iran, and different from the Hungarian rock and roll, different from American rock and roll. But there is a commonality. There is something about it that pulls this whole thing together. And I say this because, contrary to what people like to suggest, that American jazz and American rock and roll music imposed itself on countries, just look around the world how rock and roll were made their own. And take, for example, Iran. Well, no wonder the Iranian regime hates rock and roll so much, because if you look at the history of rock and roll in Iran, it's the history of resistance. And so there's a lot we can learn from it. But that music is a combination of Farsi, traditional Farsi music, traditional Persian music, and American rock and roll. And there is nothing wrong with that. There is really nothing wrong with that.
So let me ask a more personal question coming from the audience, which is, what is the favorite gig you've ever done and why?
Wow, that's a hard one.
I thought I was cutting you a break on that one, but
I would say no, because I've had some really amazing ones. I've been in 7 different bands, so I'm thinking of the best one from each band. But I'd say the one I love.
And let's hope members of the other bands aren't watching.
I know, right? Don't get offended, y'all. The last time I was able to play live in Edinburgh, because as I said, that band, they all live there. I'm the only one that's an American. I'm the only person that's female. And the audience was all Scottish people who, you know, they're not Black, they didn't grow up in the US, but they loved that concert because they just felt the music. I'm a very emotive singer, and I just, to be able to communicate like that across that culture, that cultural divide, and just the language of music and unifying us. I'd say that one. And then one that I did in Shanghai, where the audience was completely Chinese, and none of them had ever been to the US, and they loved it as well. So the fact that music is such a universal language that half the people there did not even speak English, but they just loved the passion that I showed in the songs, and just connected to the music and the power of music to unify people who have nothing else in common. I think for me is the thing. So I'd say those 2 gigs.
I would say all of my gigs with the Coalition of the Willing, but maybe the first at the Hungarian embassy in Washington when we were just making our debut is the most unforgettable. But also playing the Knitting Factory in New York. I mean, the venue itself isn't so impressive, but the fact that my kids were in total disbelief that their lame dad was playing at the Knitting Factory, that will be a source of eternal satisfaction.
For those who don't know, Knitting Factory is a very funky and very hip place in New York. If you're playing there, then you're really cool. Yeah. I played there too. So Sandy, you and I have.
I credit András with getting that gig.
Well, you know, it was yeah. I mean, all the gigs we did with the coalition were fascinating. You know, we did concerts at Walter Reed. We did a concert, you know, for fallen soldiers, and I agree. The first concert where Brent Scowcroft was sitting next to my amp was kind of really cool. But there's one concert, Sandy, you were not part of that because you were actually at NATO. We did a concert for Maya Angelou, and I have to tell you that the fact that Maya was in the audience and Bill Clinton was in the first row, you know, rooting for the band, I don't think you can beat that. But I don't know. All of my favorites, you know, playing for Bush Senior and Barbara Bush sitting there with us. I mean, kind of crazy. But this one concert for Maya Angelou was very touching, and soon enough, unfortunately, she passed away after that. But that was a big concert. Thank you. That's a good question. Never thought of it.
So another question wonders about, you know, we've talked about the role of music internationally, but a question that I presume the person that wrote it was riffing off of polarization in the US today, and wonders about if there's a way to utilize music to help cultivate mutual understanding domestically. Can music bring together the Trump supporters and Biden supporters of this world?
Well, it's interesting when you look at, you know, genres that are supposedly, you know, more liberal people listen to them, or more conservative people listen to them, but then you listen to a mashup like the song, what's it called, Old Country Road, that came out. So Lil Nas X and the country singer, those two were never supposed to be together, but that was million seller record. Well, not record, right? Recording. We don't have records anymore. But that's an example of the ability to do that, but it's just so rare. I mean, that's probably why it sold so many. So seeing more of that happen would be great. When I grew up, of course, you listen to Black music or white music if you were a Black person. I was a person who liked Yes, and I liked, you know, Journey and all those things, but that was not typical in the 70s when I was growing up. Now people are starting to come together a bit more, but more of that can happen. I honestly believe that the advent of the music video started that process when people were watching the same things on TV rather than just the radio. But, you know, there's more to do with that, but I think that getting I think the genres that are most affiliated with Black America, urban America is rap, and for, you know, the Trump folks is country. So if you bring those somehow closer together, then you have something.
Sandy?
Yeah, I would hope that music can become something that bridges the partisan divide. Although I can't remember what the songs were, but I recall during the last campaign, the Trump campaign was being sued by some rock groups to stop the use of their intellectual property in the campaign. So we may be moving in the wrong direction. But music.
I think was one of them. Springsteen, I think, was one of them.
Was it Springsteen? Oh yeah, that's right. So we may be moving in the wrong direction, but maybe 4 years of calm, almost boring leadership by Joe Biden will maybe depoliticize things that have been totally politicized in the last few years.
So I might surprise you, but I'm an American now. I'm an American citizen. And so one of the things I feel deeply about this country. And the thing that bothers me most is really the divide. And I personally believe that if I look back to the 60s, where music really, really helped bring whites and African Americans together, and just remember the bands that were performed together, Black people and white people performed together, facing sometimes audiences that wouldn't want to see this, and I think it made a whole lot of difference. Thank God we're a long way from the 60s, but I do think the divide we have today is a little different. But I sincerely believe that not only is music a possibility, I think musicians have the obligation to figure out how they can be part of mending American society. Maybe this sounds a little too optimistic. Maybe this is because I'm a brand new citizen of the United States, but I do believe that this is a role we musicians have to play.
What's a role that you might give, or what's some advice that all of you might give to maybe the future ambassadors in the audience, Penn students, many of whom may perform or, play instruments, be involved in music in one way or another themselves. There are future ambassadors. What advice would you give them for how to think about using music in a sophisticated way? That's the wrong way to think about it.
I want to start because I actually went to Penn and I was in counterparts when I was at Penn. So there may be people out there in the a cappella space or in some performing arts space. I was also in choradramatics. So if you're a student who does plays, I did that. And I will say to all of you, keep up the things that you're passionate about throughout your life. So I was at a fork in the road where, and I know John Legend because John Legend was in counterparts. That's very famous. I knew him when he was a student. So you have a fork in the road. You can say, I want to be a professional musician and try to make it doing that. Or I want to actually do another career that I've gone to Penn to study. I decided to always do both and be true to myself in doing both. So I say to you, if you're a performer and you're a Penn student, continue to perform throughout your life, no matter what you're doing for a living. You will be a happier person and people will respect you for it. So that's my advice to them.
Yeah, I would say if you haven't already taken up an instrument, you're never too old to do that. But music does, I think, open doors when you're serving abroad, and it provides an additional dimension of immersing yourself in a foreign culture when you're abroad, if you decide to join the Foreign Service. And I think that whether you just play the guitar or you actually are a serious classical musician or you sing in a choir, it's worth being a participant and not just a listener. And you'll find unexpected opportunities to kind of revive your interest in music in the course of an interesting diplomatic career. I mean, I hadn't played the drums for over 20 years until András came over to my residence in Brussels in the late 90s. And we literally were a garage band before Coalition of the Willing kind of hit the stratosphere. So it's it's both fun and it opens doors. And as I said, you're never too old to play music.
My advice is be honest, be serious. Make sure people don't think you're, it's just a fun thing you're doing. But when you're doing music, if you ever dare perform for your clients, make sure it's good. And don't forget that with music, you acquire an extra language, a language that is so powerful that you will be able to break through barriers that would otherwise be impossible to break through. So keep that in mind. But there's one thing I want to tell you all about Sandy and myself. We were some of the damn best diplomats in America and in Europe before we ever dared show off our musical skills. You cannot guitar yourself into the White House, and you cannot not drum yourself into the Kremlin. So be serious about your diplomatic job, but be equally serious about your musical skills, and then you will have a really, really potent tool at your hand that will be very, very special.
Well, that is a great way, I think, to end this this event. Thanks so much to all of you for this fascinating discussion and for taking the time to speak with us about music and international diplomacy. As someone that cannot play an instrument, this inspires me maybe to maybe I'll pick up the recorder again or learn something else. And thanks to all of you and to the audience for joining us for this edition of Global Lens. And we hope that you will join us again next Tuesday, April 27th, for our final The World Today of this semester, featuring former U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, who will discuss emerging threats in American defense policy. We will drop links to both of these events in the chat. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel and find out about all the great events we're planning over the semester by following us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at Perry Worldhouse. And thanks again to our super interesting panel for teaching us so much about the intersection of music and diplomacy. Thanks a lot and have a great day, everybody.